Alright, hey guys, and welcome back to another video. So today I'm going to talk about collecting for the Sega Saturn, but not US games, not European games, Japanese import games. Maybe you've considered it before, or thought about it, or tried, but said, oh, maybe it's too expensive, or maybe you didn't think it's possible for whatever reason. I've pulled out my whole collection here, and I've grouped up a couple of different categories of games, and I'm going to talk about, the benefits of collecting for the Sega Saturn, the disadvantages. There's some very expensive games, but there's also some more affordable games. There's cheaper alternatives to the US library. There's games that are in Japanese but are totally playable. So what do you say we jump right into it, and we'll figure out if collecting for the Sega Saturn import games are for you or not. So first of all, we have to talk about how you play import Sega Saturn games. And the first step is, first of all, getting a Sega Saturn. But then it's way easier than you probably think if you've never looked into this before. The only thing that you need, and the way I would recommend to play import Saturn games, is you just get an action replay cart like this that plugs right into the back slot in your Sega Saturn. These things used to cost about $20, but of course as the market rises, the price goes up, and now they're about $35 to $40 for one of these carts. You can get it on Amazon. There's a couple on eBay, but I'll put a link down below if you're having trouble finding these. There's a bunch on Amazon right now. But you just put this in. You put one of your import games right in your US Saturn, and it boots right up. There's no trouble. All games will work, with the exception of certain arcade games that use more RAM than others, and you might require a different cart to get those to run certain fighting games. But I didn't have a problem like that. But for the most part, 98 to 99% of the Sega Saturn library will run with this cart, and that's it. You're ready to play Sega Saturn imports. It's as easy as that. And then all you got to do is just get the game. So obviously you're not going to be able to find most of these in most, well, I shouldn't say that. Most mom and pop retro stores probably have a pretty decent sized collection of Sega Saturn imports. The problem is most of them are going to be like horse racing games, mahjong games, like stuff that you just don't care about, and you don't want to pay for that. And that's another thing I'd recommend. If you're getting into collecting for import Sega Saturn, don't go on eBay, and don't be fooled by those big lots of games that are like 100 games or 50 games for like $100, $200 from Japan. You might look at it, they'll put a couple of the pretty decent titles up on top in the picture, but the rest of it is complete garbage, and chances are those couple of games that are in there are probably not that great anyway. So do not buy one of those huge lots, don't get suckered into it, it's just filled with junk. You want to be more selective. There's certain titles that you want to go for, there's certain titles that you definitely want to avoid. The Sega Saturn import library is very large, it's very extensive, so make sure you do your research, and that's why I'm here to help you kind of figure out certain games that you want to keep your eye out for. So, let's start with the first stack of games here. So, the first category of games, and I don't have too many of them because, well, I didn't buy import games for this reason, but there are cheap alternatives to US release games. So in this case, you have Astal, which is starting to rise in price. It's a great platformer on the Sega Saturn, and this is the US equivalent here. The US version is starting to go for about $60, but the Japanese version you can get for around maybe $30 to $40. It's not the biggest savings, but it's totally playable without knowing Japanese. Another instance is in Japan, they have a compilation of both Clockwork Knight games. They also have them individually, but this here is a compilation of both Clockwork Knight 1 and Clockwork Knight 2. So you get two games in one, and I can guarantee you that compilation will probably run you a bit cheaper than buying both of these games separately on the market. Alright, now games that I don't have on the import Saturn but are good examples are the Panzer Dragoon series. So games like Panzer Dragoon, you can get this on the import Saturn for, if you're patient, under $10, whereas the US version is about $30, and you don't need to know Japanese. Same thing goes for Panzer Dragoon 2, much cheaper on the Japanese version. It's like $10 to $15. US version I think is getting way up there. I think this game is well over $60 now. And then of course there is Panzer Dragoon Saga. I used to own this as an import version, but I sold it because I traded it actually because there's no point in having it, because once you have the US version, I don't want the Japanese version. But even the Japanese version of Panzer Dragoon Saga, if you're so inclined to just try it out, is about $30. And then last but not least, another game that's very expensive that you can buy is Saturn Bomberman on the Japanese Saturn. So I think it runs maybe $10 or $20. I haven't looked, but that's just my guess. Whereas this version runs well over the $100 range. And then a game that I own, because I don't have the US version, is Guardian Heroes. So the Japanese version is easily buyable for $10 to $15, I would imagine. Whereas the US version, I'm assuming, is probably well over the $100 mark right now. So those are just some of the benefits of price saving when it comes to importing games to the Sega Saturn for games that are still, for the most part, somewhat playable without having to know any Japanese. Alright, and then the next stack of games here I have are mostly exclusives. There are a few that are on like the PlayStation and such, but for the most part, all of these are only available on the Saturn. And these are games that are, some of them are very heavy in Japanese, but they're still totally playable, and I'll explain that. And others are in Japanese, but you can play them without a problem. It's just fumbling through the menus a little bit. So these are games that you're going to want to look out for when you're collecting for Import Saturn. They're a little bit lower on the price range as opposed to the other stack of games I'm going to go through here. So anywhere between $10 on the low end, and some of these games are about $80 to $100, but there's only a couple in here like that, and I'll talk about those when I get to them. So the first game is Dungeon Master Nexus. This is exclusive to the Import Saturn in the Dungeon Master series, and this is very much playable. It's in Japanese, but a lot of the menus are icon-based, and there is Japanese text, but you can totally get through this game without a problem. It might take a little bit of trial and error, but it's very much playable. And then next we have a game called Wachenroder. This is exclusive to the Sega Saturn in Japan. And this is a strategy RPG in a steampunk setting. Now the game is entirely in Japanese. The battles do have very helpful icons to make the battles very easy to play. But the thing is, there's also a guide online that's totally in English. It translates all the text in the game, all the story. So you can totally play through the entire game in its entirety with that guide, no problem. And this game is pretty cheap. It's maybe $15, $20 at most. Okay, and next is an action game called Hissatsu. This is pretty hard to find, and it's a little bit on the expensive side, maybe $50 to $60, $70 max. But this is another exclusive that's based on some like television show in Japan. I've played it, it's pretty decent, it's worth looking out for. Little cutesy platformer called Ninpen manmaru. It's a little ninja penguin. Really, it's kind of easy. There's no combat to be said, but it's a cheap game exclusive to the Saturn. And these are the kind of things you got to look out for when you're collecting. Night Striker S, there's a version of this on the Sega Saturn, and I think there might be another version or two. There's an arcade version of this as well. But this one has some exclusive Saturn benefits, like an exclusive level and everything. But this one is also starting to go a little bit up in price. It's maybe $40 now, I think, the last time I looked. But this is another one that you can play without a problem, without knowing any Japanese whatsoever. Alright, and next is a set of games that are also in the same group as the previous, where you don't have to know any Japanese to have fun with these ones. So first is Bulk Slash. This is a mech action game where you can switch between your mech and an airship on the fly. Graphically, it's one of the best looking Saturn games that I've seen. It's a lot of fun. It's starting to rise in value, though, quite a bit. I don't think you could really get this for under $100, but I'd argue that it's worth looking out for, especially if you're collecting for the system. Okay, here's a game that you can kind of fumble through without much problems, and that's Linkle Liver Story. This is an action type game, a little bit of RPG elements in there, but if you're a fan of games like, old school Legend of Zelda, this might be worth looking into. I haven't spent too much time with this one, but it's very cheap. You can get this for under $10, no problem. Alright, and this is Willy Wombat. This is another exclusive to the Import Saturn. This is a 3D, over-the-head, isometric kind of action platformer. It's very cheap, that's why I threw it in here, and just showing you the possibilities of games that you didn't probably know even existed on the Saturn, and this is pretty cheap, $15, $20 at most. Okay, and this is Keriotosse. I've actually done a review on this, so I'll put a link to that below in the description if you want to check it out, or in an annotation. This is a 3D brawling party minigame kind of thing, sort of like a Smash Brothers-esque kind of thing. Or if you remember back on Bomberman 64, where no, Super Monkey Ball, where you try and knock off the other players off the map. I'm sure you remember exactly what I'm talking about, the minigames in Super Monkey Ball. It's very similar to that. It's fairly cheap. It's pretty uncommon, though. Check it out. It's another exclusive that's worth playing. Here's another exclusive that's relatively cheap, and that's Bomberman Fight. This is a really fun iteration of Bomberman that uses a 3D render over-the-head isometric view. And oh my god, is it fun, because the explosions in this game are absolutely insane. It's very fast-paced, it's very fun. You can only get it on the Import Saturn. Definitely, if you're going to import for the system, this is one of the first games that you should check out. Necronomicon. This is a pinball game, once again only on the Saturn. Really fun, totally playable. It's a little hard to find sometimes, but when you do find it, you can easily get it for between $20 and $30. Alright, and this next set of games are games that actually have full English subtitles, so it's basically like you're playing a game that was released in the US. You wouldn't even know that it's an import, aside from the box that has Japanese on it. So the first game is this Wizardry compilation. Let me see if I can attempt to pronounce the subtitle. LLylgamyn, Saga. Okay, so this is a compilation of, I believe, 3 different Wizardry games And there's an option to turn everything into English. So if you're a fan of Wizardry or dungeon crawlers, this is one to look out for, definitely. Okay, and this last one is an exclusive for the Saturn once again, and that's Shadows of the Tusk. This is a strategy RPG that's completely in English, and you can only get it from Japan, and it's pretty cheap too. So those are just some of the options that you have when it comes to cheaper games that are on the import Saturn that you can play without any knowledge of English. Alright, so now that I've shown you some of the more affordable, easier to find games that you can play without knowing any Japanese, I wanted to move on to a darker side of Saturn collecting, and that's the more expensive, rare, sought-after games. Now, years ago, these games used to cost at most, the more rare ones, $100 to $200, with only a couple pushing that $200 barrier mark. Now, most of these games that I'm about to show you, some of them are pushing the $400 to $500 mark each. So if you're looking into collecting some of these more sought-after gems, you better be very picky and very choosy with what you buy. I'd argue that maybe only one or two of these games are worth that price. So what do you say we go through some of my more rare Saturn games? I have a lot more, but these are just a few that I wanted to go over. The first one is Shinrei Jusatsushi Taromaru, or Psychic Assassin Killer Taromaru. You know, there's all different kinds of translations for this. But this is an action game that's exclusive to the Saturn. It got a very low print run. I have a review of this on my channel. And this is almost going for $500 now. You know, you can get some copies for around $350 to $400, but certain copies are getting near that $500 mark. Now, it is rare, it is sought after, but it's also a really, really good game. You can check out my review to see what I think of this, and this is one of the few games where I'd say if you can get this for around the $300 mark, I'd say go for it. I say it's worth it, but I'm going to leave that up to you. Alright, and for platformer fans, you're not left out either. There's a few exclusives, such as Tryrush Deppy. This is an amazing side-scrolling platformer where you play as a little yellow taxi. This game is also starting to push the $200 to about $250 range. And I'd argue if you're a fan of platformers, this one's worth tracking down. If you can get it for the sub $200 mark, I'd say go for it. I'd say it's worth it. It reminds me very much of like a treasure platformer kind of game. It's so good. Check it out. And then also Super Tempo. Now my copy is sealed, so unfortunately I haven't been able to play it because I don't want to open it up when it's sealed. Considering this game is starting to go loose, you know, well, not loose, but non-sealed for about $250. So I can't even imagine what a sealed copy is worth. This is actually a sequel to Tempo on the 32X, and it's supposed to be pretty good. Alright, and this is, I forget the exact subtitle for this, but this is Keio Flying Squadron 2, essentially. You might remember that game on the Sega CD, the very expensive side-scrolling shooter. This is not a side-scrolling shooter in its entirety. There's some elements in here where you are, but for the most part, it's a platformer, and this one is also breaking the $100 mark now, so get it while you can before it gets too expensive. Alright, and next is another sequel to a 32X game, exclusive to the Saturn import, and that's Stellar Assault SS. This is pushing almost the $300 mark, and unless you're a huge fan of first-person spaceship shooters, I would not recommend this for that price. It's a great game, it's graphically really good, it plays really well, but man, do not pay that amount of money for this game. Okay, and next up is Batsugun, which is one of the more affordable, and I haven't checked recently, but I'd assume this game's about maybe $80 to $100, and that's on the low end when it comes to some of the more sought-after shooters on the Saturn. It's worth tracking down if you're a fan of bullet hell shooters, because it's definitely one of the most bullet hell heavy games on the system. Okay, and this next one is also on the PlayStation 1, but the Saturn version looks better based on what I've seen and heard from other people, and that's Soukyugurentai, and this is... It's an amazing game. Get it while you can, because I think the price is starting to go up on this. I haven't checked recently, but I think it's around the $70 to $80 mark. But if you're going to import for the Saturn and you're a shooter fan, this is probably one of the first ones you should absolutely go after. Next up is one of the most sought-after games for the Saturn, especially in the shooter library, and that's Battle Garegga. This one is starting to push towards the $300+ mark. And most, well, I shouldn't say most, a lot of people in the shoot-'em-up community consider this to be one of the best, if not the best shooter across all systems of all time. I don't agree with that. I've played way better shooters. This game is very hard, but it actually adjusts the difficulty on the fly, so the more power-ups you have and the better you're doing, the harder the game gets, the more bullets there are. It's a very interesting dynamic, so I can see why people really love it. And graphically, this is absolutely one of the best-looking games on the Saturn. There's just so many explosions, so many particles, so many bullets. The detail on the ships and the enemies and the bosses in this game are absolutely stunning. Is it worth the price? If you're a shooter fan, I'd say maybe, just to give it a try. Alright, next is Steam Hearts. This is one of those hentai shooters. In other words, it's actually a pretty decent shooter, But between levels, there's some pretty funny and graphic anime cutscenes with some really risque stuff in there. The PC Engine version is much more graphic. They show some things that the Saturn version doesn't show, but I didn't buy this game for that, trust me. I bought it for the gameplay. I did. Next up, you can't go wrong with a cave shooter and one of their earlier works, Danpachi. Definitely check this one out. I don't think it's that expensive. I think it's maybe only $40 to $50 at most, so worth checking out if you're a shooter fan. Next is Shinrei. There's also a version of this in the US on the PlayStation that I played that is absolutely god-awful. The music is like not even existent from what I played unless I have a glitched out copy, so the Saturn version is the way to go. It's getting up there in price though. I think this is also breaking the $100 mark. Guardian Force, another game that is definitely not worth the asking price. This goes for $200 to $250 now, and it is not that great. It's a tank, well, it's a shoot 'em up where you play as a tank. Control-wise, it's pretty unique in that, you know, you can aim your shots much more so than other traditional shoot 'em ups. It's very slow-paced though, the music isn't that great, the levels aren't that inspired, so this is definitely more for collectors and not so much for people that are looking to spend $250 on a pretty good game. Next is Blastwind. This game is really, really rising in value. Last time I checked, this is like $300 to $350. Definitely not worth that price. It's a great game. It's got some really over-the-top explosions, but the levels all feel very similar. It's got some really good music, though, like really good music, but definitely not worth that price. Alright, and lastly is a game that I would argue is worth the insane price that it's commanding, and that is Hyperduel. This is a game that is starting to near the $300 to $400 range now, and I would say that if you're a fan of shooters, but you have to be a fan of horizontal scrolling, somewhat slower paced shooters, you know, it's not a cave bullet hell shoot 'em up, it's not really fast paced, it's very slow, it's very methodical, but man, what a well designed game this is. Graphically, the sprites of the enemies and your characters and just everything in this game, level design wise, is just absolutely fantastic. It feels right, the weight of the ships, you know, you can transform between being a mech and a ship to increase and decrease your speed and, you know, your weapon power up. I mean, it's just, there's a lot of different elements going on in this game, and it's very hard. I don't think I've ever passed the 4th level. I think that's as far as I've got. But it's one of those games where, you know, you gotta keep pushing, and, you know, I play it over and over when I do pop it in my Saturn just to see if I can make it that much further each time, and I do. I steadily make progress, and it's just a really rewarding game. You know, it is expensive, but I would say if you're a fan of shooters, this is one that you should really look into adding to your collection. I'd say it is worth the price because it's just that good. Well, anyway, guys, that's going to conclude my video for figuring out if, you know, the landscape that's out there for collecting import Japanese Sega Saturn games, is it right for you? You know, there are a lot of affordable games, there are a lot of expensive games, but it's not all about those, you know, sought-after ones. There are the more, you know, less sought-after games that you can get for a pretty decent price. So hopefully that's helped you decide, you know, whether or not you want to get into collecting for the system. Maybe it's going to be your first time importing, and it can be kind of intimidating and hard because you're going to have to do most of your shopping on eBay or Japanese, you know, game shops online. But I think it's worth it, guys, and hopefully this video has helped you out. If you want to see more videos like this for other systems that, you know, I import games for, like the Super Famicom, the PlayStation 1, you know, what have you, just let me know in the comments below, and thanks guys for watching, and I'll see you soon.